This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
We started the Last Lecture series as a school-wide annual event in 2012, modeled after similar lectures throughout the country. Last fall, student leaders at each UCSF school were asked to nominate one of their faculty members. These faculty members were then introduced to the larger student body through a voting platform. The winner of that vote is our speaker here tonight, Dr. Dan Lowenstein. Dr. Lowenstein attended medical school at Harvard, where he met his wife and fellow UCSF faculty member, Dr. Milo Schaff. Our special thank you to Dr. Schaff for being here tonight and for being a wonderful mentor to many UCSF students through the global health pathway. After medical school, Dr. Lowenstein completed an internship in pediatrics and residency in neurology at UCSF. He stayed on as a faculty member here, establishing the UCSF Epilepsy Research Laboratory and working on fundamental aspects of the biological basis of seizures and epilepsy. Dr. Lowenstein briefly left UCSF to serve as Dean of Medical Education at Harvard Medical School from 2000 to 2003, where he oversaw the redesign of their curriculum as well as the creation of a new educational technology program. In 2003, Dr. Lowenstein returned to UCSF. He is now professor and vice chair in the Department of Neurology. In addition to his clinical work and research in epilepsy, Dr. Lowenstein is actively involved in establishing scientific policy at the national level and is a beloved teacher in the School of Medicine. Over the years, Dr. Lowenstein has received every major teaching award, both locally and at UCSF, as well as on the national scale. A student I spoke with quite appropriately said, "It isn't possible to be a medical student here at UCSF and not be a great fan of Dr. Lowenstein. His passion towards patients, teaching, and the advancement of medicine is what UCSF is about." In true testament to how beloved Dr. Lowenstein is, after announcing that he was delivering this year's last lecture, we received quite a few phone calls from folks who were genuinely concerned that this was going to be his last lecture, or that he would be announcing his retirement tonight. Rest assured, Dr. Lowenstein has promised me that this lecture prompt is only a hypothetical one. So hundreds of students across all of our schools voted Dr. Lowenstein to give tonight's lecture. On behalf of all of them, I ask him, Dr. Lowenstein, if you had but one lecture to give, what would you say?
Thank you, Neha, for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate your kindness. And I am completely humbled by the invitation from the students to deliver this last lecture. And I have to admit, now I'm totally overwhelmed by the number of people who have come to spend this time together. So to all of you here, to the students, to the faculty, to the alumni, to the staff, a number of my patients, other friends and guests, and whether you're here in Cole Hall or some people are over in HSW and maybe down at Mission Bay, maybe watching on computer screen. I know that our two kids, Mira and Stefan, are watching. Hey, you guys, I love you. Thank you so much for coming here, and thank you for this honor. So just a quick disclaimer. In preparing this, I've put a lot of thought into the words for this talk, and there's been a huge amount of input and advice from Milo. I'll be relying on my notes, and it's not because I don't want to be looking in your eyes the entire time, but that it's actually more important to me that you hear the precise words that I've chosen. I'll state from the outset that I've taken the assignment quite literally. And if this was indeed truly the last lecture of my life, the last opportunity to share some thoughts with my students, with the community here, the people that I care for, what exactly would I say? I have to admit that the urge to deliver a lecture on epilepsy or headache is totally overwhelming. But I will refrain from doing so. But I have to admit that the experience of thinking about what I would share with others if this was the last day of my life is actually not foreign to me. I think about death fairly often. Not in a morbid way, but because it's so crystal clear that death can come to any of us at any moment. And as Gandhi said, live as if you were to die tomorrow, learn as if you were to live forever. And this exercise leads to thoughts such as, what would I do if this was my last day? What thoughts would I hope to have streaming through my mind if this was my last day, my last hour, the last minute of my life? And what would I say to the people that I love? So before I start, let me ask that of you. Project forward to what will hopefully be a very long life. For the students in here, that's like 100 years or more. And you've lived a long life, and hopefully a life well lived. So what are the thoughts? What are the memories? What are the images, the feelings, the lessons, the core beliefs and truths that you imagine or you hope might go through your mind? And what words of wisdom would you convey to the people that you care for as you pass from this lifetime? So actually, let's do that. So get comfortable in your chair, and you can close your eyes. It's going to be a minute. You can keep your eyes open, but just literally think about what if it was the last part of your life? What are the thoughts that you hope might be going through your mind? Okay, I wish I could hear your thoughts. What memories did you choose? Why do you think these were the ones that were most immediate? And what would you say to your loved ones? So now let me try to fulfill my part of this bargain. Let me take you with my process on the journey of my last minute. And like you, my mind is filled with stories, important stories, stories of people, of experiences, of events that have shaped who I am and how I view the world, stories that are the source of any wisdom that I might have gained. And I've organized these stories into a number of themes, or maybe you could call them threads, which course through many of our lives and which will perhaps, I hope, resonate with you. And they are adventure, passion, justice, and joy and sorrow. So let's begin. Adventure. Like you, I have a store of adventures deeply ingrained. But I want to choose one of those real adventures that prove to be transformative, an experience that might set our course on an entirely new direction, that alters our understanding of who we are. And I'm talking about adventure with a capital A. Not those smaller events that might be new or exciting, like maybe deciding to move to a new city, or, I don't know, going skydiving for the first time. No, I mean adventure with a capital A. And my definition of adventure with a capital A is that it's got to feel like a spectacular opportunity for failure. That is, deep down inside, as you're contemplating your plan, you're saying to yourself, there is an exceedingly good chance that I am totally screwed. Of course, you don't go into an adventure thinking that you're going to fail. That's my definition of a fool. So I've had the good fortune of experiencing a number of adventures with a capital A in my life. When I was 21, I traveled around the world by myself for a year, and this was actually at a time when you could go overland from Istanbul to Delhi, that is all the way through eastern Turkey, through Iran, through Afghanistan, over the Khyber Pass, into Pakistan, through Lahore, Amritsar, and Delhi, for $25 on the, quote, magic bus. I've also climbed extensively in the Cordillera Blanca and had a spectacular adventure and a trip with my two sons in the far western parts of China in a remote area called the Pamir Mountains. But there's no question at all that the greatest adventure for me was the one that I experienced with my best friend, Tim Miner, when I was 20 years old. And that's when we decided to take a canoe trip across the wilderness of Quebec. Now, Tim and I became... I wonder what you're laughing at. Now, Tim and I became friends while playing soccer together in high school in New Jersey, but the core of our friendship was forged in rural New Hampshire, at Tim's real home, a small town called Sandwich. And Sandwich was the base camp. It really is called Sandwich. There's Center Sandwich, there's East Sandwich, and so forth. So Sandwich was the base camp for our innumerable experiences: hiking, canoeing, skiing, mountaineering, backpacking. And among many things, Tim introduced me to the beauty and the solitude of the wilderness and the outdoors. And there is no question that he is the most accomplished outdoors person that I've ever known. And it was sometime in college, while Tim was at Dartmouth, I was at Boulder, that we decided to plan an expedition in which we would attempt to cross the watershed of the province of Quebec, starting in the south and heading all the way to Hudson Bay. Now, I think the main motivations was our absolute love of the wilderness, the desire to challenge ourselves like never before, both individually and as a pair, and to confront the unknown. A side benefit of this plan was that I was able to convince the geography department at the University of Colorado to give me 15 credits a full semester under the title Experiential Studies. So on June 11th, 1973, Tim and I headed out into the wilderness for what was, without question, an adventure with a capital A. For one thing, we actually had very little idea whether it was possible to reach our destination. We had heard that trappers in the 1800s had navigated from the St. Lawrence Seaway all the way to the Hudson Bay, but actually there were no accounts of this journey and there were no guides of any kind. We were told that there was a post named Nichiquan that was sighted at the approximate midpoint of the trip, but we couldn't verify whether it was actually inhabited. And we were warned by the people at the Ministry of Natural Resources in Quebec City that the land was immense, parts of it unnavigable, and, quote, many unknowing and unprepared people have been lost up there. But we were committed and undeterred, and in retrospect, a little bit foolhardy, as we set out from Gagnon, about here, on that June day, to paddle the roughly 700 miles or so to Hudson Bay. Now, I know this is going to sound ancient and unbelievable to many of the people in the room here, but at that time there was no GPS, no cell phones, no Google Maps, and actually no way of contacting the outside world. Actually, that's not completely true. We had a flare gun and 2 flares, which, if working properly, was supposed to loft the flare up approximately 200 feet. But of course, that was useful only if there was a plane nearby, and we actually never saw any planes. So anyway, those of you in the audience who have any canoeing experience at all know that 700 miles in a canoe is actually not necessarily that far. Depending on the conditions, you can easily make 25, 30 miles in a day, even 50 miles. But it all depends on the terrain and the current and so forth. But there's actually a critical factor of the voyage that I haven't yet pointed out, and that is that the first 250 miles or so was all upriver. So we started out in open water here, Lake Manicougan. And here the paddling can be pretty straightforward. The only thing that keeps you from making progress is the winds, which weren't too strong most of the time. But once we got on the river, on the 5th day of the trip, we had to go against the current. And this meant for the next 100 miles or so, pulling the canoe with ropes, using a technique called lining, pushing it along or pulling it with a rope in the water, or portaging, that means carrying your gear. And the gear weighed about 300 to 400 pounds. And that meant that we'd have to carry this stuff along the banks of the river, and oftentimes there was never any trails. There was lots of underbrush, and oftentimes we'd actually have to hack our way through that. And given all the gear, portages required 5 trips. So a mere quarter-mile trip was actually 1¼ miles, and our longest portage was 3 miles. 3 miles long, meaning it was a 15-mile effort. And if this was not enough, there was also the fact that it was rainy and cold almost every single day. The mosquitoes were terrible, and the black flies were even worse. Tim actually had the record for killing the most mosquitoes with one swat of his hand on his shoulder, 28. One day we capsized and lost a significant amount of food, and by the time we made it a few weeks into the trip, we realized we had no idea whether we would ever actually make it to our destination in Nichiquan, and we were beyond the point of safely turning back. And to be honest, we were really miserable most of the time. But whether we were lining the canoe, trying not to slip on the wet rocks, or pushing the canoe out of an eddy around a boulder while waist deep in water, or hauling our gear through the tundra, we were entirely focused on the task at hand, of working as a team, of helping one another, of looking out for one another. Now, there were a few moments of respite, if not delight, but they were all related to one thing: food. We actually didn't realize it at the time, but we were slowly starving from a lack of sufficient calories and proteins. We had expected to fish and hunt. The fishing was actually pretty good the first week or so, but then it totally ended. And the only thing we ever caught was a porcupine. And I can tell you there's not a lot of meat on a porcupine. So food became something of an obsession. And if you could have listened in as we were having lunch, for example, you would have mostly heard silence. However, at one point, while dilly-dallying our way through our half cup of Gorp ration per day, Tim might say something like, "Hey, Dan, try this. Take 2 M&Ms and a peanut, and then wash it down with maybe some raisins." Yeah, that's pretty good, Tim. But the very best time of day was when we had finished dinner and we'd clean all the cookware, we'd cinch down the gear, and we dove into the tent and then tracked down every mosquito that had followed us in before we zipped out the netting. And then exhausted but awake for a few minutes, we'd lie down tucked in our sleeping bags, sheltered from the bugs and the rain and the need to keep moving, and one of us might say, "Tim, is it your night or mine?" "I think it's mine, Dan." "Okay, go ahead." "My mom makes the best apple pie." "Tell me about it, Tim." Night after night, we reveled in the thoughts, swear to God, it's in my diary, of all the foods that we would eat when we got home. And by the end of the trip, I was actually starting to talk about things that my mom made that I never really even liked. Now, the most critical point in the trip was when we reached the watershed. And that's the source of the rivers draining to the south. And here we had to navigate across a vast area of marshes and ponds and lakes to eventually find the waters on the other side of the watershed, heading to the northwest, over here. And we actually ended up being lost for 2 days because of the confusing passages through this region. Each of these are tiny islands. And I am absolutely certain that we never would have made it out were it not for Tim's extraordinary sense of direction. You have to remember, We didn't have any GPS back then. We were relying solely on our maps and our compass. But Tim was the one with incredible focus and concentration who led our way out of this labyrinth and eventually found the path to Nichuquan, which fortunately turned out to be inhabited, and we were able to restock. We had gone 6 weeks without seeing another human being, and in the end, we completed a 2.5-month trip to reach James Bay. So, that's what we looked like when we, and there's Nichuquan right there. We actually had to sit for 2 days and just watch it because the winds were coming right at us. So, this was one of my greatest adventures, and in retrospect, Tim and I actually can't believe that our parents let us do it. But the trip had an enormous impact on my life. It demonstrated the awesome power of friendship and the way we complement each other in our abilities and our perspectives. And it demonstrated the importance of absolute focus and attention to the task at hand and our capacity to prevail under the most trying of circumstances. And most importantly, it taught me not to be afraid of adventures with a capital A, at least as long as I planned for enough food and less luck. Passion. As you reflected on your thoughts a couple of minutes ago, I imagine that most of you, like me, included some that relates to your life's work, to the efforts we've devoted to accomplishing something of value, of using our talents productively, of allowing our passions to make the world a better place somehow. So many of you know that my passions in work have been tied to teaching and being a physician scientist. Now, whenever I walk into a room to teach, I feel like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I've had the great fortune to work at a place like UCSF, and it's a place that attracts the most talented and caring students on the planet, as well as the most creative and collaborative faculty and staff. Now, when I think back, I've had a lot of great teachers in my life, beginning with both my parents. With great love, they indoctrinated all 3 of their children with the mantra that there are 2 tasks in life: caring for others and getting educated. But certainly the person who had the most impact on my own development as a teacher, although I didn't really realize it at the time, was Mr. Brian Biemuller, my high school biology teacher. To be honest, most of high school and all of high school and virtually all of college is mostly a blur. But I have indelible images of Mr. Biemuller and his classes. He made the classroom come alive. He would always start a lesson with some captivating questions, ones that would draw in even the most indifferent and apathetic 10th graders, and believe me, there were many of us. So here's an example. To launch into a lesson on behavior and psychology, he started the class with this first alluring question. How many of you have dogs or cats as pets? About half this class hands went up. How many of you think your dogs or cats love you? You know, about the same number go up. Then, eyes gleaming, he would just reel us in. He'd say, "They don't love you. They just see you as a reliable source of food." To which the pet owners howled, No, that's not true. I know they love me." Well, how do you know that? Because whenever I come home, my dog is always waiting there at the screen door, and I know he's looking at me with those loving eyes. I know he loves me. Mr. Biemuller says, "He doesn't love you. When he looks at you with those loving eyes, all he sees is a big, giant, juicy piece of steak." And so began a discussion of anthropomorphism, Pavlov's dogs, the biology of behavior, and the importance of critical, careful observation with quantitation. Here's another one. He started a class by saying, how many of you like French fries? Everybody's hand went up. He said, do you think that you could survive on a diet only of French fries and water? And thus we were swept into 2 amazing weeks of nutrition and the physiology of digestion and metabolism. It turns out you can't quite make it. Not enough vitamins A, B12, and E, and calcium, selenium, but they come pretty close apparently to being the perfect food. So I actually had a chance to speak with Mr. Biemuller for the first time after many years, about a month ago after I got this invitation to give this lecture. And I tracked down his number in New Jersey. I spoke to his wife, Mary Ann, who answered the phone, she said that he knew that he would really enjoy getting a chance to speak with me, but he wasn't going to be home for a few hours. And although he's been retired for more than 20 years, he was out actually doing one-on-one tutoring with students who are having difficulty getting to school because of behavior issues or illness. But he called back later that night, and the enthusiasm and the energy and the joy in his voice was exactly like I remember it 43 years ago. And I told him how much of an impact he'd had on me as a teacher. And I asked him, what's your secret? What's your secret to being a great teacher? And he said, Dan, it's pretty straightforward. With kids in high school, there's only 2 topics that are interesting to them: food and sex. So how do you make a topic like botany interesting? Just start the class by saying, do you think plants have sex? Or to get into genetics, just ask the student if they're planning on getting married any day, and when they answer yes, just point out that they probably should pay careful attention to that set of chromosomes that they're going to be spending the rest of their lives with. So near the end of the conversation, Mr. Biemiller asked me a question. He said, do you think that someone can be taught how to be a great teacher, or is it something that they're born with? And I thought about that for a moment, and I answered, I think that most great teachers are born with a passion for teaching that rarely can be taught. But it really only boils down to one single question, and that is, do you love your students? If so, then all the characteristics of a great teacher follow. There was a pause, and Mr. Biemiller said, I completely agree with you, Dan. Now, of course, there's lots of different approaches and styles that constitute great teaching, but it still comes down to whether at your core you truly love your students. And if so, everything else follows. Passion for a subject and taking the care and the focus to teach it well. A desire to see your students excel far beyond what you've accomplished yourself. And compassion for students who are struggling, because it's going to happen to all of us at one point or another. So my other passion in life has been working as a physician and doing what I can to improve the lives of people living with epilepsy through research. Now, it turns out that becoming a physician was hardly a part of my plans growing up. In fact, nothing could have been more unlikely for the first 23 years of my life. I actually had a relatively trivial but nonetheless traumatic experience when I was about 13, and it made me swear to do everything under my power to never enter a hospital again, under my own volition anyway. And it wasn't until I did an EMT course while preparing for a climbing expedition that I allowed the world of medicine to re-enter my mind. And by the end of 3 months of climbing and another 2 months working as a volunteer in the Hospital General in La Paz, Bolivia, the path was obvious. I wanted to become a doctor. The mixture of science and humanism, the opportunity to serve others in such a fundamental way, the rawness, the poignancy, the intensity, all lined up to become my dream. And I can honestly say to every one of you that since that time, 36 years ago, there has never been one moment, one instant, when I've doubted that this is what I wanted to do with my life. Now, I admit, however, at the outset, that I really didn't think that I'd get involved in academics and research. But with time, I came to realize that I wanted to help advance the field, to focus at least as much attention on what we do not know as what we know. And this, of course, is what a place like UCSF is all about. A place where we use imagination and creativity to try to find the answers that translate into better care for the patients that we serve. And there is no better place in the entire world to do this kind of work. And if we don't do this work, then the care of the patients that I see every week in clinic will be exactly the same in 20 years from now as it is today. And speaking for my patients and myself, that prospect is totally unacceptable. So, now looking back, what can I tell you about the art of being a healer? I'll just highlight 2 points. The first point is actually a treasured piece of advice. You might call it an heirloom that I learned from one of my teachers. I remember so well when Milo and I were second-year medical students and we were drowning in the mile-deep well of information that we were supposed to be learning. We couldn't possibly study any harder. We felt totally overwhelmed. And talking over, we decided to seek our advice from one of our closest mentors, a brilliant anatomy professor named Dan Goodenough. True? And after we poured out our frustration and angst, he responded by saying, "Milo, Dan, why did you ever think that medical school would be easy?" And the clouds sort of parted, because he was absolutely right. Why would anyone ever think that this path of learning as much as is humanly possible about the nature of illness and disease, and of being directly responsible for the care of patients, would be anything but extraordinarily difficult? And I actually learned a secret a little bit later in life about this, and that is nobody has an easy path in life. Virtually everybody works extraordinarily hard. So the path is not an easy one. The second point is that there are many ways to be a humane and accomplished healer. And patients have many different needs depending on their circumstances. And I'm reminded of the experience that my family had about 19 years ago when my father was diagnosed with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. And as many of you know, this is one of the cruelest of all diseases because it slowly paralyzes the body, but typically keeps the mind intact. When my father first developed his symptoms, he was so thankful for the extraordinary kindness and patience shown by a young academic neurologist back east, who carefully and methodically evaluated his condition to determine whether there was anything that might be treatable. And even though there was essentially nothing that could be done to alter the course of the disease, my dad and the rest of us were equally grateful for his family practitioner, a wise and devoted physician who quietly did everything necessary to lessen his misery and allowed my father to meet death with great courage and dignity. On the other hand, sometimes the art of a healer can take a very different form. This brings to mind a story, one of my favorite stories, that one of my former medical students told me a number of years ago. He was pursuing his MD PhD work in the lab, and he noticed that his right hand and face felt numb. So he went down to the acute care clinic and was seen by a doctor who was definitely concerned about this combination of symptoms and appropriately requested a CT scan. And this actually revealed a brain tumor growing in the left hemisphere. Fortunately, the tumor had qualities that suggested that it was going to be benign, but it needed to be dealt with immediately. Word quickly spread out throughout the hospitals that one of our medical students was in need of neurosurgical care, and it was enormous relief to the student when he learned that one of the most famous and accomplished neurosurgeons in the world, Dr. Charles B. Wilson, who was also the chairman of the Department of Neurological Surgery at the time, had agreed to personally oversee his care. So the student had an MRI scan in the late afternoon, and he was admitted up to the 8th floor of Moffitt, and he was examined by what seemed like 10,000 residents and medical students. And he anxiously awaited the moment when he'd get the chance to meet the doctor who was going to be able to provide the care that he so desperately needed. The student asked his nurse, would he get a chance to speak with Dr. Wilson before the surgery the next day? And the nurse said to him, they're in the operating room right now, but they'll definitely be making rounds. It's going to be later tonight. So 9 p.m. came and went. No Dr. Wilson. 10 p.m. came and went. No Dr. Wilson. The student was starting to get a bit anxious. 11 p.m. came and went. No Dr. Wilson. The student was finding the anticipation unbearable. Finally, just before midnight, the nurse peeked into the room and whispered, "They're coming." And the student sat bolt upright on the edge of his bed. Moments later, in walked Dr. Wilson, followed by the parade of fellows and residents and nurses and medical students who all lined up along the perimeter of the room. Dr. Wilson stood in the center of the room, holding the student's MRI scan. He looked intently and momentarily into the student's eyes, held the MRI scan up to the ceiling light, and said, "I can get it." And he did a half turn and left the room. And the student later told me, those were the 4 most beautiful words I've ever heard in my life. So I have to emphasize that this account over the years has probably lost track of some of the events that actually happened. And I say this firsthand because I actually got to know Dr. Wilson while he was still practicing, and I was a resident and junior faculty member. And I saw firsthand his kindness and generosity. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that all these approaches to healing, careful analysis, bearing witness with compassion, the skilled procedure, all have their essential place in the care of the patient. And it would be even more correct to say that there are an infinite number of paths from which to choose. And the challenge is to find the one that is best aligned with your talents, your gifts, your genius, your passions. And it's my real hope that all of you, both the students and perhaps the not-so-young people here, will come to realize at some point that your work is not only what you want to do in life, but it's what you were meant to do in life. Justice. Now, one of my earliest memories in life is actually sitting with my sister in the back of our family's Rambler station wagon while driving around in the outskirts of Baltimore. And suddenly an amusement park with a roller coaster came into view, and my sister and I begged my father to take us there, but he sternly refused. We were totally crushed. And I learned several years later that my father's refusal was due to the fact that the amusement park was segregated. No colored people, as they were called then, were allowed. This experience had a really vivid impact on me. And as I grew, it snowballed into additional events and with flashes of understanding. There was my father's lifelong emphasis of the importance of true freedom for all. This was etched in his mind by the suffering that our family went through in the Holocaust and epitomized by the Passover story that he recited every year. There were the very diverse public schools that I had the good fortune to attend, and the summers I spent on my grandfather's farm working among the migrant workers, and later my travels around the world. And all of these experiences have made it impossible for me to ignore the overwhelmingly destructive impact that racism and prejudice continue to have on individuals, communities, and nations. Intolerance fuels the horrific wars and conflicts, the vast economic disparities, and even many of the inequities in our healthcare system. And as much as we wish it was not the case, the struggle continues right here at UCSF, where sometimes women, people of color, people at the bottom of the power structure, and even some of our patients continue to suffer from biases, discrimination, and unfair treatment. Far, far less so, and usually in more subtle ways than are present elsewhere in many parts of the world, but present too often nonetheless. Regardless, I am filled with hope. I'm filled with hope because there's no question at all in my mind that progress is being made. I'm filled with hope because history has shown that there are extraordinary people who come along with the clarity of vision and the courage, like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. And I'm filled with hope because history has shown that every single one of us has the potential to contribute to this progress. And one need not look beyond our own campus, even this very hall, to know this is true. Now, some of you may have heard this piece of history, but many of you have not. And I think it bears repeating. I know the medical students have heard this in orientation each year. It's worth hearing it again. Let's look back 45 years ago to 1968, when our campus was very different from today. Despite civil rights legislation, despite the 1963 March on Washington, despite the mandate for affirmative action by Lyndon Johnson, our campus was definitely not the campus that would reflect the stated ideals of equal opportunity for all. For example, the medical school class in 1966 was 86% male, 14% female. Of a class of 131, there was 1 African American, 1 Latino, and 11 Asian or Pacific Islanders. And among the latter ranked faculty, there were only a handful of women and minorities. And then there were the basement people. The basement people were the janitors, the maids, as they were called back then, the laundry workers, the kitchen workers, and the patient escorts. Almost all of them were minorities, and many of them were African Americans. At that time, about 500 African Americans were employed on the campus. A few were administrators, a handful were research technicians, and almost the rest were basement people. And why were they called the basement people? Because if you were a black janitor working on the 14th floor of the hospital and had to go to the bathroom, you needed to go down and use the lavatories in the basement. If you were a Latina maid cleaning a patient's room. You couldn't use the facilities on the floor. Those were reserved for the healthcare professionals and the laboratory technicians. You needed to go down to the basement. And when it was time to eat, even if you worked in Moffat Cafeteria, you could buy your food, but you weren't allowed to eat it there. You had to go down to the basement. 1 month after the assassination of Martin Luther King on May 4th, 1968, a meeting was held right here in Cole Hall. About 400 African Americans on this campus, mostly basement people, packed this hall and initiated a movement that transformed this campus forever. This was the birth of the Black Caucus, and the caucus, in parallel with the newly formed Latin American Campus Association, or LACA, and other minority groups, drew up a list of demands that they presented to Chancellor Fleming 2 weeks later. The demands included access to staff bathrooms, consistency in the payday schedule, occasional weekends off rather than split days off, and what else? A demand that the university remove the biases in the admissions process against qualified minority students, and a demand that the university actively recruit more minority faculty. Now, let me just re-emphasize the importance of what I just said. The basement people were not just making demands related to their own needs. They had crystal clear insight into what was going on in the hospital wards. They could see how the lack of diversity among the faculty and the trainees was actually hurting patients. And they recognized the frustration and the injustice suffered by qualified young people who dreamed of pursuing careers in healthcare, but were denied a place purely on the basis of the color of their skin. So these basement people and a handful of faculty and students put their livelihoods on the line for what the ideals were that they believed in. And they called press conferences, they broke the unwritten rules that existed about where you could eat or rest, and they eventually staged a work stoppage that forced a response from the campus leadership. And these were the events that have transformed our student body. The nature of the admissions programs at all of the schools were carefully re-examined. New chairmen were appointed to those committees, and attitudes that valued diversity became an integral part of the selection process. And the rest is history. As Michael Adams, our former director of the Office of Affirmative Action and Equal Opportunity, has expressed so well, these seats in Cole Hall, these seats, they're sacred seats. Can you feel the presence of the basement people? Can you see with the same clarity of vision? Can you feel the compassion that they held for those who simply wanted to be treated equally and with respect? They are true heroes. The basement people and the others who took the action at that time, and all of us here owe them an enormous debt. They are my true heroes. And in fact, a number of the original members of the Black Caucus are here in the audience today, and I'd like you to join me in recognizing them. Now, other heroes have carried their banner through the years. There are several events that stand out in my mind. In 1995, as a campus, we spoke out forcefully against the anti-affirmative action Proposition 209. In 2007, hundreds of students and faculty supported the national call to action against for-profit takeovers of healthcare systems. And in 2006, the Iraq Action Group filled Millbury Union to highlight the health effects of the Iraq War, the effects that it was having on our own military and hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians who were caught in the crossfire of an unjust war. So, no matter what path you choose, I hope you'll take up the banner of the basement people and the other crusaders who have come with the insight and the compassion to see the inequities and the injustices that still continue to exist. And despite the progress, despite all the effort, our work isn't done, including, as I said before, right here at UCSF. So pick something pick something far bigger than you are and try to figure out how you can make some impact, even some small impact, to at least continue on this very long march. So, now what about the joyous memories that are flooding through your mind at the end of your life? I see the freedom and the dreaminess of camp in northern New Jersey, driving the tractor on my grandfather's farm. That flash of Nichiquan coming into view on that canoe trip and realizing that it was actually inhabited. Reading the first few words of that acceptance letter to medical school, receiving my MD degree, making a discovery in the lab, the fun and the laughter in brain, mind, and behavior, watching another class of students graduate. But, like most of you, I'm sure, these memories are transcended by the joys that are connected to my family. My father, who inspired my brother, my sister, and myself to value learning and freedom. My mother, a social worker and the kindest person I have ever known, who's still teaching us by example the meaning of selfless service. My brother and sister and their families, and most important of all, my 3 children, and Milo, my partner and soulmate. So Milo, it's been almost 31 years ago since we declared our love and our commitment to one another before our family and friends under those magnificent granite arches in Yosemite Valley. And in the end, there are no words that I can find that adequately convey the gratitude I feel to you for your grace, your wisdom, your beauty, your patience, your support, your way with words, and your strength, other than to say, I love you. There are so many joyous images of family. Seeing Milo for the first time walking down the hall in the dorm at the beginning of medical school. I actually don't have a picture of that. Working together as medical students in India, climbing, reaching the top of Mount Rainier, trekking in Nepal, kayaking in Alaska. The arrival of our 3 children, whether in the delivery room or being placed into our hands by a nursemaid in Fuzhou, China. The birthday parties, the epic family trips, the mountain summits, our medical work in Bolivia last summer. So Milo and Alex and Stefan and Mira, my mother, my father, my sister, my brother, my grandparents, these are the main images that I will see as I pass on. And these are the experiences that really make life worth living. But then there's the suffering. Life is not the fairy tale that we were led to believe. And anyone who works here in the medical center knows that this is clearly true. Life's suffering is on display in virtually every hospital room, in the hallways, in the elevators, in the waiting rooms. And I've always felt that one of the hidden gifts of entering medical school or any of the health profession school is that as young people, we're given the opportunity to learn one of the fundamental truths of life. And that is, if you're healthy and content, then the only difference between you and the person who is suffering is your own good fortune. Nothing more, nothing less. Sure, there are certain benefits of making good decisions about how we act and how we care for our bodies. But the bottom line, as you will witness countless times, is that there is a thin and ephemeral veil that separates ourselves in the moment from those who are suffering. Now, a number of you are aware of the tragedy that befell our family 2.5 years ago. We lost our son Alex to a terrible accident when he was 24 years old. And the moment we heard of his loss, we passed through that ephemeral veil. And although I had had experiences with the veil, I didn't realize the dimensions of this netherland. How passing through the veil would slice through our innermost hearts and cause more pain and suffering than I ever could have imagined. So I'm sorry for any sadness that my words may be causing you, because I know that virtually all of you have lost loved ones, whether it's a parent, a grandparent, a partner, a child, a close friend. And I've learned that you have to be really careful about comparing notes on the experience of losing the most important people in your life. But I feel compelled to tell you why it is that Milo and I and our children continue to progress on a path of healing. Part of our healing lies in the knowledge that we were so fortunate to have shared 24 years with a truly remarkable soul, someone who was and still is the source of so much joy in our lives. Another part of our healing comes from the existence of really, really strong spiritual roots, roots that have been developing for many years and, thankfully, have proved to be very firm. Roots that come from believing in something far greater than ourselves, and from an understanding that the transient nature of existence will mean that anything could be taken away. The danger of attachment, which is virtually everything but what we have in the present and the love that binds us together. But there's one other reason for our healing. When Alex passed away, the four of us were cast into blackness, falling, tumbling, out of control, beyond understanding. But after some time, we began to sense the presence of something different. The image in my mind is of the slow and subtle coalescence in the darkness of a web or a piece of cloth that collected around us, slowly reversing our fall, holding us, protecting us, and gradually lifting us back up towards the light. And that fabric, I realized, was made of threads of all different types of sizes and hues and lengths. And it was formed by the connections we have with the people in our world, with the family and the friends and everyone else who cared for our well-being. So your compassion, which came in the form of phone calls, emails, letters, hugs, food, helping to plan Alex's celebration of life, even your silent thoughts of caring and love, were what lifted us out of that darkness. And for that, we are forever grateful. And I should remind you that the fabric is always present. I can feel it in this room. I know it's there because the connections that we all have with one another. It's a fabric that is so vital when the suffering of this imperfect world comes hurtling our way. Well, it's time for the last part of this. We made it through the themes, or the threads, the banners, and the fabric. And so to close this last lecture, I want to tell you one last story. It's actually my favorite of all stories, and it's one that I've actually told every year for the last decade or so at the end of the first lecture of our neuroscience course for the medical students. You guys know this one. But I think that the best story is worth repeating. So, the story is told of a young man who, having lost his sense of direction and meaning, decided to travel the world in search of more wisdom and insight. Along the way, he learned of a great master who oversaw a monastery in the far reaches of the Himalayas, an esteemed teacher who was reputed to have a deep understanding of the meaning of life. The young man decided to find the teacher, and after many years of travel, he finally reached the monastery and learned that he would have to work and study for a few months before being granted an audience with the master. While waiting, he learned the routine of day-to-day life at the monastery, and he befriended many of the monks, some of whom had lived there happily for many, many years. He also discovered, curiously but to his delight, that a popular pastime was the game of chess, a game with which he was quite familiar. After a few months of living in the monastery, the traveler was told that the time had come for his audience with the master. So he was led down a long hall to a large room, in the middle of which was seated an old man with a wizened face, holding a staff. The old man looked at the visitor and said, "I understand that you've come here to find the secret of living a life of deep meaning and fulfillment." Then he smiled and said, "Let's have a game of chess." And with that, the chessboard was arranged, and the master asked one of the old monks to sit across from the traveler at the chessboard, and then he said, "Let the game begin. And oh, by the way, know that whomever loses this match will be banished from the monastery forever." And the game began. Now, the traveler was a very good chess player, and in fairly short time, he was actually able to gain the upper hand. But when he looked at the monk across the table, who was near his equal in chess, he began to wonder about the well-being of the monk should he lose and have to leave the monastery. The traveler had come to know this old man over the past number of months and knew how happy and much loved he was by the other monks. These thoughts interrupted his game, and he looked down at the chessboard to discover that he was no longer winning. And in fact, he was within a few moves of checkmate. So he refocused his complete attention on the game and began to gain the upper hand. But a few minutes later, again, he couldn't help but gaze into the eyes of the old man, and he became engrossed in thoughts about the sadness the exiled monk might face. When he stared back down at the chessboard, he once again found himself near the point of losing the match. So he battled back with great focus and effort and began to prevail. And so it went, back and forth, the traveler struggling to find a way of winning the game while at the same time caring for the monk's well-being. Finally, he decided that the only way forward was to quietly play for a draw. And when the master saw this, he took his staff and upended the chessboard, sending the pieces flying, and he said, "There, my friend, that's the secret to living a meaningful and fulfilling life. Great concentration and great compassion." Great concentration and great compassion. Great concentration, like Tim's remarkable ability to find that passage to Nichiquan, or the genius of Charlie Wilson's hands, or our amazing capacity to focus our attention and learn our crafts and take care of patients and make scientific discoveries. Great compassion, like the love that Mr. Biemüller still feels for his students, or the extraordinary actions taken by the basement people to fight for the rights of others that they never even knew, or the comfort given to my father by the neurologist and the family practitioner, and the outpouring of joy and support and care that we provide for one another, regardless of the circumstances. Great concentration and great compassion. My friends, make these the watchwords of your life. Bring great concentration and great compassion to everything that you do. And let's add one more phrase. Great love. Great love. Treasure the people in your life and use your spiritual compass to spread that love throughout your universe. And you'll find from one of the Eastern sages that you'll bring heaven to earth. So, that's the content of my last thoughts, my last lecture. My words to you, the people for whom I care so much. But what is in your mind? What are the thoughts in your mind? Take it on. Take on this process seriously and deliberately. And on reflection, you'll find, I truly believe, the depth of the meaning of your life. Thank you. I love you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lowenstein. I know I speak on behalf of all of us that we are honored to be here tonight and honored to listen to your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve.